Hi, this is Ecology Part 2. As you watch this video, pause the video to take notes. You're going to turn those in for a daily grade today. The things that you should write down in your notes are going to be written in yellow. So stop each time and take the time to write those down in your notes. So for part 2 of our ecology notes, we're going to be focusing on how species interact with each other and how ecosystems respond to damage. So we're going to start this section of the notes by exploring the different types of relationships that organisms might have with each other in nature. These relationships could be positive or negative in the way that they impact each other. It just depends on the type of relationship. So we'll go through each one of these. The first one we're going to look at is called coevolution. Coevolution is an example where two species are evolving in response to each other over a long period of time. So in this example, there's a snail species that has evolved to have a thicker and more spiny shell. And in response, the crab, its main predator, has evolved to have stronger claws in order to crack them open and eat them up. Also, see the hummingbird's amazing beak in the picture? It has evolved to match the shape of the flower that it loves to sip nectar from. You're already familiar with predator-prey relationships. It is a negative relationship for the prey, but a positive relationship for the predator. Even herbivores or plant eaters can be considered predators of plants. Pause and jot down this definition of predation in your notes. Next up is symbiosis. Symbiosis is a relationship between two different organisms. It literally means living together. We're going to be talking about two different types of relationships where organisms live together: mutualism and commensalism. In our first example, mutualism, it's a symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit, so it's positive for both of the species. For example, these birds are cleaning pesky insects off of the rhinos, and it gives the birds a nice snack. So positive for both. The clownfish help to defend the sea anemone, and they also feed it with their waste. So the sea anemone, in return, provides a protective home for the fish. So again, it's a win-win situation when you talk about mutualism. Commensalism is a symbiotic relationship where one species benefits and the other is not affected at all. These cattle egrets follow cattle around and they eat the insects that the cattle kick up in the grass. So it helps the cattle egrets by giving them a snack, but there's no benefit to the cattle because they're not actually cleaning insects off of the cattle like the example we saw before. In the second picture, we see hummingbirds with a nest built in a tree. Birds benefit from building nests in trees, but there's no positive or negative effect for the tree. So it would be positive and 0 when we talk about the relationships and the benefits. Next up is parasitism, one of my favorites to talk about. The parasite benefits in this situation, but the host is either harmed or killed, so it's negative for them. So this would be a positive and negative relationship. Some examples we see here are this crustacean on the far left. It eats the fish's tongue and then anchors into the fish's mouth where the tongue once was. And then every time the fish eats, it steals a little bit of its food from it. Ew! Parasites like ticks suck blood from their host. And then this third example is a cowbird, which is a nest parasite. So the little yellow bird is the mother, and a female cowbird never builds her own nest. Instead, she goes and dumps her eggs into another species of bird's nest. Like you see in the picture at the top, you can see the large egg that belongs to the cowbird. And then the poor mama never realizes that those are not her own babies, and she takes care of them and raises them. and the cowbird babies often kill the mama bird's actual young. We're going to talk about two types of competition. The first one is called interspecific competition, competition between members of different species. And the example in the picture would be the lion competing with the hyenas for food. The second example is two lions competing against each other. They are members of the same species, and we call that intraspecific competition. So they are perhaps competing for food, mate, or territory. So competition is negative for both species involved in the relationship. So you're going to want to make a chart like this on your notes. So you'll want to pause the video to sketch it, and then take a few minutes to enter positive and negative or plus and minus signs. Positive for a plus sign for a positive relationship, a negative sign for a negative relationship, and then a 0 if it's no impact. Feel free to use your notes to fill out the chart. When you have finished filling out the chart, start the video again. Okay, now you can check your work against mine. Remember, positive stands for a positive relationship, the plus sign. Minus sign stands for a negative relationship, and the 0 means it's not impacted at all. How did you do? All right, resource partitioning is a different way that species can share resources and avoid competition. You can see in this example that all of these birds feed in a slightly different way, but use the same tree. So they sort of break up the resources and share them. Here's another example of how birds might share the same stretch of beach, and they use their bills in different ways to feed. So they're not actually competing against each other. They're partitioning the resources instead. We've already learned about trophic cascades, where the removal of a top predator like a wolf might lead to a ripple effect in the feeding levels below it. Remember the sea otter and the urchins we talked about as well? Here's a diagram showing what a trophic cascade in action might look like. So we also talked a little bit about keystone species before as well. Keystone species are so important in the environment that when they are removed, they can again have that ripple effect on the feeding levels below them. So they have an unusually large effect on an ecosystem. And they're named keystone species because of this architectural feature, the keystone. If you remove that one stone, the whole arch will crumble, just like the ecosystem might crumble. A beaver is an excellent example of a keystone species that lives in our local environment. They are considered to be architectural engineers. They cut down trees and use those trees to build their lodge, and that changes the nature of the water flow and the body of water where they live. They create habitat for other species, which can lead to an increase in waterfowl, an increase in fish, more nesting sites for birds. So beavers are a keystone species right here in Lawrence, Kansas. So habitat is all of the living and the non-living parts of an environment used by an organism to survive. A niche is sometimes called the ecological address of an organism because it's all the different ways an organism uses its environment, including its habitat. So we need to talk a little bit about what happens when an ecosystem is disturbed or disrupted. So Ecosystem disturbances can disrupt an ecosystem, and they can be caused by humans, such as deforestation, or they could be caused by a natural event, such as fire, that we see here on the right. There are two categories of succession that we're going to be talking about. Succession means changes to a community after a disturbance. The first one is called primary succession, and that's when the disturbance is so extreme that it's going to remove all the living organisms, including all the vegetation and often the soil, and the species will very gradually return. And two extreme examples of that would be like a volcano that explodes and that hot magma flows down, turns into rock, and kills all of the vegetation. And so this picture on the bottom is an example of a species that's one of the first to come back and reclaim an area that has been covered by volcanic rock. And this is called a lava cactus. I took this picture in the Galapagos Islands. So the cactus can kind of wedge themselves into cracks in the rock, and they will break down the rock and turn it into soil so that other living organisms can come in and live as well. In the picture on the top, you can see that this was a human-caused disturbance. Somebody created a parking lot covering the vegetated field, and the cracks in the parking lot are places where pioneer species can come in and start to live and thrive, and they'll continue to break down that pavement and create soil. Here's a graphic showing how primary succession happens very slowly. Notice that this process could take hundreds of years. Here's a picture of primary succession taking place at Mount St. Helens right here in the United States. You can see that it was a very slow process for the trees to return. Secondary succession happens when there's been a less severe disturbance in an area. So not all of life is removed, and often the soil is still intact. So the process of living organisms returning to the area is much faster. So this could happen after a fire, a flood, an area that has been farmed or logged. If you have lived in Lawrence since 2019, you probably remember in May that we had a tornado that skimmed the edge of Lawrence and hit Linwood pretty severely. These pictures are taken in the Linwood area. This house belongs to Miss Vertoshnik, our former art teacher here at LHS. And you can see how the vegetation was damaged. So the vegetation is now in the process of regrowing and recovering, and that would be a great example of secondary succession. So once again, notice that this process can be a lot faster than primary succession. Rather than hundreds of years, you might have a mature community growing in just 150 years. So when you get to that mature community, that ecosystem is called a climax community. And it could take many years to reach this after a disturbance, but it really depends on what type of ecosystem the disturbance took place in. That is the end of your part 2 notes for ecology. So if you need to go back and write down any of your notes, any of the items in yellow, make sure you do that. And then snap a pic of your work and turn it in for your assignment on Google Classroom.